Scorn for flaws in temperament and attitude rather than philosophy, they came over as feckless, hesitant, complacent, lacking the stomach for a fight, combining radical minds and conservative hearts, paralyzed by their insistence on seeing both sides of an issue and fearful of action and partisanship. The fundamental difference revolved around the issue of power. Radicals understood, according to Alinsky, that only through the achievement and better use of power can people better themselves, where liberals protested, radicals rebelled. Given the heroic concept of community organization, a program is limited only by the horizon of humanity itself. It was not surprising that Alinsky also had a heroic concept of the organizer. One could envision Alinsky's organizing flying high in a Superman cape, observed his biographer swooping into a forlorn industrial community ready to fight for truth, justice, and the American way. The organizer would lead the war against the social menaces of mankind. Over the next couple of decades before sudden death in 1972, Alinsky's acolytes were involved in a number of organizational efforts across the United States. Alinsky himself was particularly associated with one in the Woodlawn district of Chicago and the other in Rochester, New York. Both involved largely black communities and had as their key demands improved employment and an end to the discriminatory practice of only hiring blacks for the most menial jobs. In Rochester, the target was the town's dominant corporation, Eastman Kodak. In both cases, Alinsky enjoyed a degree of success, though this required negotiations rather than the capitulation of the employers. Not long before he died, he published another book, Rules for Radicals, which set out his basic philosophy. We shall return later to this book, which is important in terms of how he positioned himself in relationship with the other radical social movements of the 1960s. For the moment, we can consider the rules themselves. He set down 11. A number were basic to any underdog strategy. The first was pure Sun Tzu. Persuade the opponent that you were stronger than was really the case. If your organization is small, hide your numbers in the dark and raise a din that will make everyone think you have many more people than you do. The second and third were about staying close to the comfort zone of your own people and going outside that of the opponent in order to cause confusion, fear, and retreat. Rule number 4 was to use opponent's own rule book against them. And rule number 5 was to ridicule man's most potent weapon because it was hard to counterattack and infuriate the opposition. This led to rule 6, which was that a good tactic was one your people enjoyed, while a bad tactic was not only not fun, but also rule number 7 dragged on and became hard to sustain. This was because rule number 8, the essence of a good strategy, was to keep the pressure on the opponent. The major premise for tactics is the development of operations that will maintain a constant pressure upon the opposition. It is this that will cause opposition to react to your advantage. Rule number 9 was an observation about how threats could be more terrifying than the reality. And rule number 10 was about the need for a constructive alternative in answer to the question, okay, what would you do? Lastly, rule number 11 commanded pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, polarize it. Don't try to attack abstract corporations or bureaucracy. Identify a responsible individual. Ignore attempts to shift or spread the blame. These rules were those of a campaigner, and in that respect were different from a form of strategic thinking that consisted largely of worrying about how to relate, if at all, to the local power structure and the principles that should govern any action. Alinsky was all about the campaign and the specific goals that had been set for it. The rules reflected Alinsky's appreciation of the elemental requirements of strategy in terms of endurance, coalitions, and capacity for surprise, and a need to keep an eye on public perceptions. The sense of community and confidence in the organization must grow with the campaign until it became strong enough to withstand setbacks and was able to move from one issue to another. One of Alinsky's admirers, Charles Silberman, compared his approach to guerrilla warfare. He explained the need to avoid a fixed battle where the forces are arrayed and where the new army's weakness would become visible, and to concentrate instead on hit and run tactics designed to gain small but measurable victories, hence the emphasis on such dramatic actions as parades and red strikes, whose main objective is to create a sense of solidarity and community. The aim was not just to keep pressure on the targets, but also to build up the community, and was a bad idea. This was not a moral issue. He was against actions that almost guaranteed defeat, and resort to arms came into that category. Some of the tactics for which Alinsky became best known reflected a sense of mischief and provocation. One was to unnerve a Chicago department store that had discriminatory hiring policies by sending thousands of blacks on a normally busy Saturday for a shopping spree that would leave very few purchases while deterring normal customers. Another tactic intended to pressure Chicago's mayor was to occupy all the toilets at O'Hare Airport so that arriving passengers would be left desperate. The most notorious ploy, though possibly largely intended to use his audiences, was a proposed fart-in at the Rochester Philharmonic, sponsored by Eastman Kodak. The effect was to be achieved by feeding copious quantities of baked beans to young men prior to their joining the audience.